Hey, life group leaders. I'm excited for our lesson this week in Mark chapter 14. There's two different passages in our reading, and I didn't really know how to approach them where I could do them justice without making this really long. So, what I wound up doing was making two different lessons, one for the first part for verses 3 through 11, and then one for verses 32 through 36. What I'm asking you to do is just your class what they like and what they need, and then just spend the rest of the week just asking God, Jesus, which one do they need to hear? Maybe they need to hear both, and so you can find a way to cram that into our 1 hour. I just wanted to give you guys all the information you need to make an informed decision about how to best teach your class. So just prayerfully consider which one your class needs to hear. The challenges of the lesson is to stay within the text that they gave us when the events that are going on are rapidly falling into a place. There's a lot going on. Mark doesn't tell us everything. We have to go to some of the other Gospels to kind of fill in the blanks about what's going on. Building a timeline has some challenges, but we're up for it, right? That's right, we're up for it. I'm going to try to put our lesson today in the stream of events of the Passion of Jesus. So following the Olivet Discourse of Mark 13, which we studied last week, Mark introduces us to what is essentially the Passion narrative, the arrest, trial, and crucifixion of Jesus. And this is one other section of Mark where he does this sort of sandwich structure where he brings an idea up and then he puts a separate idea and then goes back to that other idea. Where we see that is we have Mark's account of the conspiracy to kill Jesus in 14, 1 and 2, and then he goes back to that in 10 and 11. And surrounding that, what those two things surround is his anointing at Bethany by what Mark tells us is a woman, but what we know from the other Gospels is that her name is Mary. So like always, we're not just going to look at the verses they gave us. We're going to look kind of what's around them as well. And in the first 16 verses of Mark 14, we are told of 4 acts of preparation that are done to prepare for Jesus' death. 2 are done in opposition to Jesus. 1, the leaders prepare to kill Jesus in verses 1 and 2. And then 2, Judas prepares to betray him in verse 11. Then there were 2 done in service to Jesus. 1, Mary prepares for his burial in 3 through 9, and then 12 through 16, the disciples prepare for the Passover meal. And once these 4 acts of preparation are completed, the stage is set for the last night and day of Jesus' earthly ministry. We are told how the leaders are preparing to kill Jesus in verses 1 and 2. They didn't want to do it during the feast because there'd be an uproar, but despite their intent, events are not entirely in their hands. The plot is going to be carried out much quicker than they intended. Before we see why, we read in Mark 14, 3 through 9, that Mary prepares for Jesus' burial in the house of Bethany. As Mark tells us, this is the home of Simon the leper. We don't know who he is, but Mark assumes that his readers do know who he is. So all we can do is really speculate, and because we do know that Mary and Martha and Lazarus are there and that had a significant event in Jesus in the week leading up to his death, burial, and resurrection, we could speculate that maybe Simon the leper is their father. Mark doesn't identify the woman who anoints Jesus as Mary, but John does in John chapter 11 and 12. And she should not be confused with the woman from Tom's message last week in Luke chapter 7. That was a different woman and a different anointing. But anointing a guest's head was a common way to honor the person at a festive occasion. Mary appears 3 times in the Gospels, and each time we see her, she is at the feet of Jesus. She's a good model for all of the disciples to emulate. Mary's offering was something called nard, and nard is an expensive perfume used for royalty and for burial. It was an aromatic oil that came from a root that was native to India. Now, I did a little bit of looking, and from the Jerusalem area to the Indian border is about 3,000 miles. To retain the fragrance, the ointment was sealed in a small alabaster flask. The long neck of the flask had to be broken to release the fragrance, there wasn't a lid on it. They literally just like poured it in and attached the lid to it, and it was kilned that way. And so it was a one-time thing. Once you opened it, you couldn't reseal it. You can't repair the jar. Once it's open, it's open. And so breaking the flask implies that nothing is held back. All of this oil was poured on Jesus' head, which makes you ask the question, where did she get this nard? It could have been an heirloom. It could have been a dowry. But one thing we do know is that it was incredibly valuable. Mark tells us that it's worth about a year's wages for a day laborer, and I just did a little bit of research that and try to convert that into today's money. What does a day laborer work in the United States? And so it's about $31,000 in today's money. Would our first impulse with $31,000, would it be to give that to Jesus? So we see Mary anointing Jesus using the alabaster jar of expensive perfume. She pours it over his head, anointing him. And John in chapter 12 also tells us that she not only anoints his head, but she anoints his feet and wipes his feet with her hair. Then we see the disciples' indignation. Now, no one's ever identified. It's never said, it just says some of the disciples. And so it makes us wonder, well, who, which ones? But they were angry because of what they considered to be wasteful, because the perfume was worth a significant amount. They thought it would have been better to sell it and give the money to the poor. As an aside, the disciples were interested in selling of goods and money. The disciples missed a chance at worship because their mind was on worldly things. And that's an interesting contrast that you can see in Mark's gospel. But John also tells us in his account in chapter 12 that Judas Iscariot was especially angry. So he said some of the disciples were upset, but Judas was especially upset, not because he cared for the poor, but because he often pilfered the money box. It was in this light that the disciples chastised Mary, and they couldn't see a reason for this waste because they didn't understand that Jesus' death was imminent, that he wasn't always going to be with them. Because when we look at waste, waste is essentially exchanging something of greater value for something of lesser value. Some in the story, Mary, understood what was really valuable here, and Jesus rewards her worship. Because worship is a value word. That's what we're doing when we worship God. Worship is an old English accounting term. It means to give something worth. So you're assessing the value of something. So when we worship God, we're essentially saying, God, you're worth this much to me. It shows a very strong commitment to Jesus. And Mary did that. She said, Jesus, you are worth more than this expensive perfume that came from thousands of miles away, probably by horseback or camel. You know, even today, when you put real money value to this, and you're like, wow, would I just throw $30,000 at Jesus? There's a tension there. You almost like, wow, that seems kind of wasteful. But when you really know who Jesus is and what he's done and the peace that he brings us, then you go, that's not wasteful at all. Be quiet, flesh. That's ridiculous because Jesus is worth it. And that's kind of the question that I ask out of this passage is how much is Jesus worth to us? And I think by looking at this passage, that Mary had a better idea how much he was worth, more than the disciples, especially Judas. So Jesus hears the rebuke, and then he turns around and praises Mary. He tells the disciples to leave her alone. He rebukes the rebukers, if you will, that she's done a good work in verse 6. And then in verse 7, he said, there will always be poor that you can give money to and to help, but it won't always be that way with Jesus. He said, you won't always have me. Jesus defended Mary's act and explained why it was appropriate. It was an act of devotion to Jesus, and it was anointing for his burial. It was preparation for his burial. And we can't tell how much about Jesus' coming death Mary understood, though she may have come to understand better than the 12 the truth that he was going to die soon. And she may have anointed it only as an act of love. We don't really know. Some people will also use this verse to argue that we shouldn't bother too much about caring for the people around us, that we don't need to pay attention as Christians to social justice because there'll always be poor people. And that doesn't seem to be Jesus' meaning here. He doesn't downplay giving to the poor. He doesn't downplay taking care of people in need. Instead, he plays up the significance of the event. So I don't think that we should interpret Jesus' statement as disregarding poor people. Mary did what she could, even anointing Jesus for his burial. She became a servant, serving the servant of all, and therefore she was exalted by the words of Christ. She was given the highest praise in verse 9. because Jesus said, "Your actions will be memorialized." And this is in stark contrast to the responses of the priests, the disciples, and Judas. Jesus' prediction about Mary's praise was fulfilled by the inclusion of her story in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John. But sadly, her act of preparation is followed by a negative one. In the next two verses in 10:11, we see that Judas prepares to betray Jesus. The Passover feast, like the Feast of Tabernacles and Pentecost, was a pilgrim feast. What that meant is that you could only celebrate the feast in Jerusalem. Many Jewish families from all over the world traveled to the temple to observe these feasts as Mosaic law requires in Deuteronomy 16. The Jews could observe the Passover only in Jerusalem, and so consequently mobs of people choked the city. One of the researchers I looked at said that the population of Jerusalem would go from about 50,000 to 250,000 during the times of these festivals. And Jesus, being a religious leader, as we just saw at the triumphal entry, that Jesus had a large popular following. So the religious leaders, as we've seen all through Mark, they wanted to kill him, but they wanted to avoid a riot by killing Jesus inconspicuously. It's evident early on that they wanted to postpone further confrontation with Jesus until after the feast were over and all of these pilgrims had scattered to their homes, so there wouldn't be a giant mob to offend. However, when Judas came to them and offered to betray Jesus, it was an offer too good to refuse. So Judas, one of the 12 disciples, goes to the chief priests with the intent to betray Jesus. Now Luke, in his account of this telling, also tells us that Satan entered Judas in chapter 22. But the agreement is made. The chief priests are glad, and they promise to pay Judas. Matthew tells us the price of the betrayal. It's 30 pieces of silver. So Judas then seeks for a convenient time to betray Jesus. Evidently, Judas' initiative to offer the Sanhedrin to betray Jesus, and that caused them to move up their timetable to kill him during the Passover feast. So if Judas handed Jesus over to them, they could do it in secret at night and avoid the hostility of the crowds, which is when Jesus is arrested is one of the things that he says. He says, I've been in the temple all day. You could have arrested me there. Why are you doing it in the middle of the night? So there's a lot of secrecy involved in it. Mary's act of devotion is the high point of this section of Mark. It provides an excellent example of worship to Mark's readers. However, there's a dark undercurrent of betrayal that ultimately becomes the dominant feature as Mary's anointing is sandwiched between two acts of betrayal. The religious leaders, Judas, and even the disciples manifest opposition into worshiping Jesus. And that's a huge contrast of the acts of preparation between Mary and Judas. And then finally, just as a little nugget, it's not in our reading, but I think it also fits in with what's going on here, is the preparation for the Passover meal itself in 12 through 16. Jesus instructs his disciples to prepare for the Passover. His disciples ask him where he wanted them to prepare to eat the Passover, as they didn't live in Jerusalem. They didn't have like a spot, so he's like, where do you want us to do this? And then Jesus gives them explicit instructions for two of his disciples, and then he makes all these arrangements either with divine foresight or Jesus has already made these arrangements ahead of time and is just informing the disciples. We don't really know. But he says, go meet a man who will provide a large upper room furnished and prepared. And the two disciples do as they're instructed. They go into Jerusalem, and they find it just as Jesus had said it is, and they prepare for the Passover meal. So now the stage is set for Jesus to keep the Passover, for Judas to betray Christ to the chief priests, for the trial, the crucifixion, and the death that will lead to his burial and ultimately his resurrection. This is the setting of the pieces for the final match of Jesus' earthly ministry. Now the events from this moment on are essentially, we're down to hours, 15, 16 maybe hours left before Jesus will be dead. So let me give you just a few questions to ask your class. Question 1, belong question, what is Mary remembered for? Why do we remember this story? And then maybe ask your class, what would you like to be remembered for? Is it some great deeds? Is it for being a loving family member? Our belief question, how do we view the death of Jesus? Is it a wasteful thing or is it a beautiful thing? Do we see it in the same light as the disciples saw the expensive nard being poured out over Jesus? We may be tempted to see it as a waste because it's really hard to follow Jesus when he says, come and follow me, and he laid down his life, and there's some opposition there. So we can quickly go to, I don't want to commit to that level yet. How do we view the death of Jesus? And then finally, our become question is, what sort of acts of preparation are we doing today? Are the things that we're doing are proving to worship Jesus, or are they proving to lead to the betrayal of Jesus? Are they things that would show our love and devotion to him? What does it look like in our life to give to Jesus the way that Mary gave? I hope it leads to great discussion in your class, that you guys would be like iron sharpening iron, and that we would all, in our community groups, would grow and deepen our relationship with the Lord. So that's part one of the lesson today. If you're like, that's enough, we're good, then don't watch the next one. But the next one, we're going to cover those last verses in Mark 32 through 36 about Jesus in the garden. And so I'm praying that God will just give you confidence about what you need to lead your class in good discussion and help them to belong, believe, and become as they grow as followers of Jesus. Appreciate you guys a lot. And if you need anything, please let me know. Godspeed.